Okay, good evening. My name is Matthew Pinsker. I'm the director of the House Divided Project here at Dickinson. It's been a big day for us. We started with the renaming ceremony in the morning, renaming Pinckney Gate and Spradley Young Hall. We had hundreds of people here, 50 descendants from all over the country. It was a really special moment. And then we had we opened up the House Divided Studio, which we haven't been able to do for a long time. And we had a number of visitors. And then now we're going to have a really special capstone. This lecture by Eric Wittenberg, our graduate from 1983, on the battling the myths of Gettysburg. And of course, we also have this incredible opportunity. We're here in the presence of the Gettysburg Address lectern. That's Edward Everett's chair from the speaker's platform next to it. If you were wandering around the lobby beforehand, you saw all of the beautiful artifacts from Gettysburg. They're all courtesy of G. Craig Kaba. Craig Kaba is this local renowned educator and collector. He's the curator of the J. Howard Wert collection, and he's been a long-time friend of the college, just very generous with his time. We run a number of programs in the summer with high school students and with other groups, and he is always willing to come and share the rare artifacts that are in the Wert collection with these students. And I'm just incredibly grateful to him. And I think all of us should give him a round of applause. Craig, if you don't mind standing up. And there's one other person I want to thank. Today, because of the renaming ceremony, as well as our regular work here during the day, we've had a collection of House Divided interns show up. We have 4 interns working on campus right now for the day, and then we had another 5 alumni interns come. And we've been grateful recently that Greg Zimmerman, who is an alum from the same class as Eric Wittenberg, class of 1983, has endowed the internship program at House Divided so that we can continue to expand our programming. Mostly what we're trying to do post-COVID is open up the House Divided studio so that people can have more regular access from the public to the kind of museum-style exhibits we have in the Dickinson and slavery material there. So Greg, I want to thank you for coming and for all of your support for the program. So let's give Greg a round of applause. And now I want to say that it's my greatest honor not to introduce the speaker, who I know well and whom, his work I love, but to introduce the person who's going to introduce the speaker, because I have to tell you something. I'm a professor at Dickinson. I've been a professor here for almost 20 years, but I am not a true Dickinsonian, right? I didn't graduate from the school. And we have one of our former interns, Cooper Wingert, who is a true Dickinsonian and also a noted Civil War author. He's a graduate student right now, but he's written almost as many books as Eric Wittenberg, and he's half the age. No offense to Eric. These are 2 of the greatest Civil War scholars in the country, and they're both Dickinsonians. So nothing could be more appropriate than to ask Cooper Wingert to come up here and introduce Eric Wittenberg, and we'll launch into our discussion. Before Cooper comes up, I just want to tell you this. Eric will give his talk, we'll have a Q&A, and then afterwards there's going to be a book signing in the lobby. Jim Schmick from Civil War and More is selling books that Eric wrote. I don't know whether he has any of Cooper's books here, but I bet he does. No, he doesn't. But we have Eric's books, and so I would urge you, if you have time and interest, to buy one of those books, support an independent bookstore, and Eric would be happy to sign for you afterwards. So without further ado, Cooper Wingert.
All right, tonight we are delighted to welcome back to Dickinson a distinguished alum, Eric Wittenberg. Eric graduated from Dickinson in 1983 and went on to earn degrees at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law and the Pittsburgh Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. And he's currently a partner in the law firm of Cook, Sladjo, and Wittenberg in Columbus, Ohio. But tonight, he will not be lecturing us about legal matters. Please save your disappointment. But instead, he'll be sharing his expertise on the Civil War, because he also happens to be one of the nation's leading and most respected military historians. To say Eric is a prolific writer is a bit like saying that Abraham Lincoln was fond of giving short speeches. It's a vast understatement. He is the author of 22 books, the recipient of countless prizes, such as the Batchelder Coddington Award and Gettysburg Civil War Roundtable's Book Prize. Some of my personal favorites from Eric's catalog include Plenty of Blame to Go Around, his excellent study of Jeb Stewart's late arrival to Gettysburg, which took him through Carlisle, and One Continuous Fight, his history of the retreat from Gettysburg. Eric's, collectively, his body of work has established himself as one of the leading authorities on cavalry operations during the Civil War. Not only is Eric practicing law and writing books these days, but he's also active in battlefield preservation groups, in high demand as a speaker and a tour guide, and the program coordinator for Chambersburg's Civil War seminars, which is all to say that Eric has quite a bit of downtime. So we are especially lucky to have him here with us tonight to shed new light on some of the myths about the Battle of Gettysburg. So without any further ado, please join me in giving a big Dickinson welcome to one of our most distinguished alums, Eric Wittenberg.
And just a quick introductory note. I first heard of young Mr. Wingert here when he was 14 years old. And I heard about this whiz kid from the Harrisburg area that was writing books about the Civil War. I'm like, 14? Really? I was playing baseball at 14. That was all I cared about, let alone writing books. So it's been my pleasure to know Cooper since he was a very young man, and it has been a pleasure watching him grow into who he is today. And what he didn't tell you is that Cooper's working on his PhD because he wants to be a history professor. And he's very much the future of the field of Civil War history, and it's my privilege and my honor to have him introduce me. And so thank you, Cooper, very much. It's also my privilege to be here. I mean, I graduated from this school 38 years ago, and I don't get back as often as I might like because I live a long way away. So being invited to come here and being on the same stage with that, the thought of it just has given me chills ever since I realized what I was going to get to do. So the fact that I'm actually here and actually going to do this presentation for you, I would have swum through anything, shark-infested waters like the sharks on my tie, just to be here tonight. So thank you all for coming out. It is a Saturday night. I understand that. There's plenty of other things you could be doing, but here you are. So thanks for coming out. One of the things that you do often when you study the Battle of Gettysburg, like I have for most of my adult life, is you come across mythology. And there's so much accumulated mythology surrounding the Battle of Gettysburg that I could probably spend 3 hours up here really debunking everything I can think of to debunk. So we're gonna go fast tonight because I got a lot of ground to cover in a short period of time. But when we leave here tonight, I hope that you're gonna come away with some understanding there's an awful lot of mythology. So let's dive right in. The Confederates went to Gettysburg in search of shoes on July 1, 1863. We've all heard that one if you've studied the Civil War. That's some actual Civil War brogans in that photograph. It's not true. Confederate troops swept through Gettysburg on June 26. They cleaned out any supplies of shoes that were there. So that on July 1st, when the Confederates were coming to Gettysburg, were they looking for shoes? Not specifically. Were they looking for supplies? Yes. But it wasn't about shoes. Just wasn't. So if you ever hear that they were looking for shoes on July 1, don't buy it. There was no Confederate cavalry with the Army of Northern Virginia on July 1, 1863, and that's why Robert E. Lee got surprised. We've all heard that one too. Well, that's also not true. This is Brigadier General Albert Gallatin Jenkins. How about that beard? Is that just not an impressive set of whiskers? A Harvard-trained lawyer from near what today is Huntington, West Virginia, had a brigade of mounted infantry, styled as cavalry, but there were 3.5 regiments of cavalry with the Confederate infantry on July 1, 1863. They'd gone all the way to the banks of the Susquehanna River, and Cooper's done some really good work on the Confederate attack on Harrisburg, and I commend it to you. And they've then led the way back down as the Army's beginning to concentrate in the area around Gettysburg. So it's Jenkins' men lead the way, and I will suggest to you that there's a very good possibility that one of Jenkins' men actually fired the first shot of the Battle of Gettysburg at about 4 o'clock in the morning on the north end on the road from Carlisle. So again, when you hear there was no cavalry with Robert E. Lee's army at Gettysburg, it simply isn't true. This is my favorite. This one makes me crazy. John Buford's troopers were armed with Spencer repeating carbines at Gettysburg on July 1, 1863. No less than Shelby Foote has continued to promulgate this myth that drives me crazy. First off, let me set one thing straight. On July 1, 1863, the Sharps carbine hadn't even gone into mass production. That didn't happen until September 1st. So it's not a physical possibility for there to have been Sharps carbines there. Now, there was a regiment and a half of George Custer's brigade, of the Michigan Cavalry Brigade, that were armed with Spencer rifles, a much longer weapon that's kind of unwieldy to use when you're a cavalryman. But those weapons were not with John Buford's division. George Custer's brigade was in a completely different division, and they don't even arrive on the battlefield at Gettysburg until late in the day on July 2. So there were no repeating weapons in Buford's command, save one that was John Buford's personal weapon, a Henry rifle. This is a breakout of the actual reported weaponry of Buford's division. Every month, the soldiers of the Army of the Potomac were required to fill out what was called an ordnance report. The adjutant for each regiment would prepare this ordnance report, was to count the weapons and report on what they had. And these numbers come from the June 30, 1863 ordnance report of the Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Potomac. And what do you see there? Sharps carbines primarily, some Burnside, yes, that's the same Burnside that used to command the Army, a few Smiths, a few Gallaghers, and a handful of Merrills. You don't see a single a single Spencer's listed there, do you? Of the 92% of John Buford's companies that reported on June 30, as you can see, about 60% of them were armed with Sharps breech-loading, single-shot, 56 caliber carbines. So when Buford and his men made their defensive stand at Gettysburg on the morning of July 1st, they did so with single-shot breech-loading weapons. 2,900 troopers versus 10,000 Confederate infantry, and they held them off for the better part of 3 hours with these single-shot, short-range breech-loading carbines. It's a remarkable piece of work, but don't oversell it. There were no repeaters there. So that's a big myth, and that's one that drives me crazy. The first day of the Battle of Gettysburg was an insignificant skirmish, only involving 2 corps of the Army of the Potomac, only involving 1 corps of the Army of Northern Virginia on one end and parts of another on the other end, so a corps and a half, right? Insignificant fight. It simply isn't true. There were more than 16,000 casualties on July 1, 1863. If that had been the only day of the battle, it would still number among the 20 bloodiest days of the American Civil War. So when you hear that, it was not a big deal, it was just an insignificant fight, clearly that's not the case and the numbers don't support it. Confederate soldier Wesley Culp died on his uncle's farm on July 2, 1863, I should say July 2. Wesley Culp was born in Gettysburg. He grew up in Gettysburg. He fought on his uncle's property. He may even have been mortally wounded that day on his uncle's property, but he didn't die there. He was taken to the nearby George Spangler farm, and that's likely where he died. So when you hear the myth that Wesley Culp died on his uncle's farm, didn't happen. These are fun, aren't they? George Gordon Meade. Meade's one of my favorite soldiers. You can't see it because he never wore them for his photographs, but George Meade wore glasses. And he had a titanic temper and a really, really good command of profanity. The men used to call him the goggle-eyed old snapping turtle because he just, and another called him the great peppery because of his language. Meade's an interesting guy. He was an engineer by training. Keep in mind that on June 28, 1863, he was ordered to take command of the Army. Ordered to take command of the Army. He didn't want that command. And as soon as the battle was over, he tried to get rid of it, and nobody would let him resign his position. So he's facing a tremendous test at Gettysburg. He's been in command of the Army when the battle starts on July 1 for 2.5 days. On July 1, he loses his principal subordinate, John Fulton Reynolds of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. On July 3, he loses his most aggressive subordinate, Winfield Scott Hancock, and on July 2, he loses the Corps commander of the 3rd Corps, Dirty Dan Sickles, and we'll talk about Dirty Dan in a little while. But the myth is Major General George Gordon Meade never intended to stay and fight at Gettysburg, and only did so because Sickles forced him to do so by ordering his 3rd Corps to move forward and take a position along the Emmetsburg Road, and thereby breaking up the Confederate attack on July 2. Well, that again isn't true. Meade held a council of war on the night of July 2nd, and this is a depiction of it. But he'd already decided to stay and fight it out, and in fact had so advised the War Department in Washington. He's reported, this is the place for this army to stand and fight. So when Dan Sickles, after the Battle of Gettysburg, tried very hard to besmirch Meade and deflect blame away from himself for the destruction of his corps, one of the claims was that Meade wasn't going to stand and fight at Gettysburg, and this was a great no-no. This was something that was the subject of lengthy congressional hearings in the winter of 1864, and it just wasn't true. So that's one of the big myths of the Battle of Gettysburg. And here we have Dirty Dan Sickles, New York lawyer, charged with first-degree murder for executing the lover of his wife, Philip Barton Key, the son of Francis Scott Key, the composer of the national anthem. Sickles shot him down in cold blood in Lafayette Square across the street from the White House one night in 1859. He was tried for murder and acquitted of it, in the first successful use of the temporary insanity defense in the United States. What was it? It was really jury nullification. He was done wrong, the jurors thought, because his wife was cheating on him. So Sickles, even though he's got no military training whatsoever, ends up in a brigadier general and in command of a brigade, and ultimately, by the winter of 1862-63, by virtue of seniority, is in command of a corps, despite having no military training. But he thought he knew more than the professionals. And on the morning of July 2, this is, of course, one of the myths that he himself helped to propagate, was that when he makes his movement forward, because he doesn't like the position he's in, he does so in violation of George Meade's orders, and by the time Meade spots it and it tries to do something about it, it's too late, because the Confederates are about to launch this massive attack. So Sickles's corps largely gets chopped to bits, and he ends up having a leg taken off by a cannonball, and it's a good thing, because as we'll see here, it probably saved him from being court-martialed. He disobeyed his orders. He moved his command forward. He later claimed that he saved the army by doing so because it caused the Confederate attack to be dashed against the rocks. Well, I'm now going to quote for you one of my favorite military philosophers, Colonel Sherman T. Potter of the 407th 7th MASH. Horse hockey. Sickles disobeyed a direct order. And but for his losing his leg to that cannonball, the likelihood is he would have been court-martialed. But what was the point of court-martialing him? Because having lost a leg, he was never going to command troops in the field again. And what was the point? But I guarantee you that had Gettysburg been a Union defeat, there's a really good chance that Sickles would have been court-martialed and cashiered from the Army instead of being awarded a Medal of Honor in the 1890s like he was. So that's another fun one. We could talk all night about Dan Sickles. Colonel Joshua Chamberlain saved the Union with his defense of Little Round Top. Anybody in the room read the Killer Angels? And that's certainly the message you get when you read the Killer Angels, isn't it? St. Joshua saved the Union, right? He may have saved Little Round Top, and it's arguable whether he actually did, but I'll tell you who was just as important is Brigadier General George Sears Greene. 62 years old, they called him Old Pap Greene, descended from Nathaniel Greene, the Revolutionary War general, a fine soldier in his own right, and George Greene, with a much smaller command against a much larger Confederate force, held Culp's Hill on the evening of July 2. And I'll suggest to you that if Culp's Hill had fallen, the entire Union position on the so-called fishhook line at Gettysburg would have fallen, because it could not be held if Culp's Hill falls. If the Confederates take Little Round Top, we'll talk about that one just in a minute. But what Greene did was every bit as important as what Chamberlain did, if not more so. But Greene, for whatever reason, doesn't get credit. Why? Michael Shara didn't talk about it in The Killer Angels, and therefore when Mr. Turner made his movie in 1992, you don't even hear about Culp's Hill. So that's another myth. And speaking of the Killer Angels, Sergeant Buster Kilrain fought with the 20th Maine Infantry on Little Round Top. Who's seen the movie? Lots of you. So you're familiar with Buster, right? Was there really a Buster Kilrain? Nope. No such person existed. Author Michael Shara invented the Kilrain character as a means of injecting himself into the story. So what you hear Kilrain say is Shara himself. That was his voice, his way of injecting himself into the story. So one of the things I know that drives the guides crazy at Gettysburg is people constantly ask him, where did Buster Kilrain fight? Well, he didn't. He wasn't there. There was no such person. Here we go. Little Round Top was the key to the Union line. Now, what do you note about Little Round Top? It's been restored to very much the way it looked on July 2nd, 1863. The western face of it has been cleared of trees, right? The crest of the hill has not. The back side of the hill has not. And it's quite narrow. If the Confederates had taken Little Round Top, could they have held it? No. Could they have put artillery up there? It was too narrow. The best you could get up there was 2 guns side by side. It's only effective and useful as an artillery platform facing west at the Confederates. So if the Confederates had taken Little Round Top, this important hill, and I'll give you another look at it here, if they'd taken it, what good would it have done them? Nothing. It's not the key to the Union position. Culp's Hill was. Pickett's charge was the largest, most decisive, and most consequential attack of the Civil War. And again, you've seen the movie, you saw how melodramatic it was, and the scenes, and the Confederate soldiers cheering Robert E. Lee. And I don't mean to downplay any of that, because it's all important, and it is all significant. But it wasn't the largest attack of the Civil War, nor was it the most consequential. In fact, it stood no possibility of succeeding, and larger and more important strategic and tactical attacks occurred at Gaines Mill, outside Richmond in 1862, outside of Petersburg in 1864 and 5, and at Chickamauga in Georgia in September of 1863. Each one of those attacks involved more soldiers than did Pickett's charge, and each one of them was a more decisive blow. So part of the mythology that we have about the Pickett's charge comes to us from William Faulkner's Intruder in the Dust, where there's this just wonderful passage about how every Southern boy at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on July 2 can hear the drums beating of Pickett's charge, and as the Virginians make their passage across that field. Well, that's all well and good, and it's great poetry, and it's great reading, if you can stand reading William Faulkner. But it's making much more of what Pickett's charge actually was. What you need to keep in mind, too, is that there was a fresh division of Union troops right behind the main line from the 6th Corps. George Gordon Meade had figured out where the attack was going to come on July 3rd. He figured they've tried the left, they've tried the right, what's left? The center. It's not rocket science. So what does he do? He moves a fresh division right up behind the main line, so that if the Confederates had managed to pierce the Union line during Pickett's charge, he had a fresh division ready to come forward and fill the gap and drive them right back. So would Pickett's charge have been the end of the war? No. If it had broken the line, it would have been driven back, and ultimately with the same outcome as the one that it actually had. And I encourage those of you who are interested in this, go to Gettysburg, find a way to get your car from one side to the other, start at the Virginia Memorial, and make your way that 1.25 miles across those fields and see the terrain that these soldiers faced as they made their march to make the attack on the copse of trees on July 3. You're going to find that once you get about halfway there, it's uphill all the way, and that the final piece of it is really quite steep, and that those Union soldiers were shooting down on you. When Lee described this attack that he planned to his lieutenant, James Longstreet, Longstreet said to him quite correctly, no 15,000 men alive can take that copse of trees. And Longstreet was absolutely correct, but it was his troops that made that assault. Why? Because the boss ordered it, and Pete Longstreet was a good soldier, and he ordered his men to do as he was told. And they suffered mightily for it. Another one of my favorites, and it touches on us here at Dickinson. Jeb Stuart was off joyriding before the Battle of Gettysburg. I love that one. I'm sure a lot of you know that Stuart visited Carlisle on the night of July 1st, 1863, and I'm sure some of you know that he shelled the town from just outside. There's a big chunk was taken out of one of the pillars of the Cumberland County Courthouse on the square at the corner of High and Hanover. It's marked July 1, 1863. The building immediately to the right of where the studio is for the House Divided project has some shell damage. Confederates were lobbing shells into the town. So it has a direct impact on us here at Dickinson. Old West even got hit at one point. Well, the myth is, and of course if you've seen Mr. Turner's movie, you see this scene where Stuart supposedly gets dressed down by Robert E. Lee when he finally gets to Gettysburg late on July 2nd. It didn't happen. And first you need to understand, Stuart was given discretionary orders by Robert E. Lee. And those orders were to take his command, and if he could pass around the Union Army, to go up the eastern side of South Mountain, cross the Potomac River, move into Maryland, find the Confederate force under Richard Ewell, and connect with them, collecting supplies for use by the Army, and do all the damage to the enemy that you can. And if you study closely what Stuart did, he obeyed those orders to the letter. To the letter. Were they discretionary? Sure. Now, the other thing is, Stuart was ordered to leave behind a force to follow along behind the Army to protect its lines of supply and communication. And Stuart gave very specific, detailed orders to the commander of those two brigades that had been left behind, is a guy named Beverly Robertson. And had Robertson obeyed Stuart's orders, he would have been in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania on the morning of June 30th, and would have escorted the Army east from Chambersburg when it moves out to march toward Gettysburg on the morning of July 1st. Well, when do you think Robertson showed up in Pennsylvania? On the morning of July 3rd. So he wasn't there. Should he have been there? Absolutely. Had he followed Stuart's orders, Stuart would have had plenty of cavalry with his command to clear the way as it advanced. Now, was it Stuart's fault that Robertson disobeyed his orders? I don't think so. And the fact that Robertson was relieved of command immediately at the end of the Gettysburg campaign and sent to South Carolina and never commanded troops in the Army of Northern Virginia again ought to tell you something. So again, when you hear this, Stuart was off joyriding, it's just not true. This is another one that makes me crazy. Jeb Stuart's attack on East Cavalry Field was intended to be coordinated with Pickett's charge, that Stuart was supposed to go around the Union and get into the rear in conjunction with Pickett's charge. And again, it's balderdash. Stuart's job was to protect the Confederate flank. Why? Because in the afternoon of July 2, fully half of the Army of the Potomac's Cavalry Corps, 4 of its 8 brigades were either operating on the Confederate far left flank or they were operating beyond it at a place called Hunterstown. Lee had no force to prevent them from sweeping around his flank unless he sent somebody out there. So what does he do? He sends Stuart out there with 4,100 troopers to prevent that from happening. And then what does he do? He also calls another brigade of cavalry to the battlefield under command of John Imboden that hasn't gotten there yet, and places it behind the center of his line. Why? So that in case the Union troopers do get around that flank and get into his rear, he's got a force to contest their movement. If you know that, then what Stewart's doing out there makes perfect sense. His job was to protect that flank. Now, if the opportunity presented itself, sure, he was going to try and make some mischief, and specifically, what you see on the map here is the Low Dutch Road, which extends down here and ultimately connects with the Baltimore Pike beyond the Union Center. But if you turn right on the Baltimore Pike, you can get right to the rear of the Union line. So Stewart will make one attempt to try and get through there, and he's repulsed, and that's the end of it. Why? His orders were to guard the flank. And if you hear this nonsense that's been spouted by a lot of people over the last few years about how Stewart's job was to get into the rear while Pickett's attack was going on, again, it's just balderdash. One more Stewart thing here. Part of this whole story is that Stewart ordered his artillery that's positioned on Crest Ridge, which is what you see here in the photograph, to fire 4 shots, and that those 4 shots were intended to tell Robert E. Lee that he was in position and ready to launch his attack in conjunction with Pickett's charge. A few things to keep in mind about that. He's 7 miles away from Lee's headquarters. There's fighting going on in between, including artillery. It couldn't be heard. There's no way that could be heard. What Stewart was doing is something we call reconnaissance by fire. If you ever go out there and you stand on Crest Ridge at the top of the East Cavalry Field and you look at the lay of the land, you cannot see the intersection of the Hanover and Low Dutch roads, this critical road intersection. You just can't. The lay of the land prevents it. Stewart knew there was Union cavalry out there, but he didn't know where it was. So what does he do? He fires 4 shots in 4 different directions in the hope that somebody's going to respond to it. And if they do respond to it, then he's able to identify the position of this Union cavalry. And that's exactly what those 4 shots were for. It's reconnaissance by fire intended to determine the position of the Union artillery. And when the Union artillery responds and ultimately blasts that Confederate cavalry right off the ridge, he's found what he's looking for. So again, when you hear this nonsense that this was supposed to be 4 signal shots, that Robert E. Lee was going to hear 7 miles away at his headquarters with heavy fighting in between, use your common sense, folks. George Custer defeated Jeb Stuart on East Cavalry Field. That's another favorite of mine. This is George Armstrong Custer. How do you like that uniform? Black velveteen with gold braid. He was described as looking like a circus rider gone mad by a Union cavalryman. He said that he wore this goofy-looking getup so that the men would always be able to spot him on the battlefield. Well, that makes some sense to me, but still, you'd agree with me, that's a goofy-looking getup, isn't it? Custer has been a brigadier general on July 3rd for 5 days. He's been promoted from captain to brigadier general on the 28th of June of 1863. He's untried, he's untested. Sure, he's commanded troops in the Battle of Hanover on June 30th and again at Hunterstown the next day, but he's an unknown commodity. He's not known to the Union High Command. They only know him as a daring scout and a staff officer. He's not trusted yet. And he's not even in command of the Union troopers on East Cavalry Field. This man was. And there's another pretty spectacular beard for you. David McMurtry Gregg, West Point class of 1855, a career cavalry officer, ended up coincidentally living most of his life after the war in my hometown of Reading, Pennsylvania, where he's buried. David Gregg was in command of the troops on East Cavalry Field, and he is the one that directed Custer to stay, and he's the one that ultimately gave the orders for the charges that Custer leads at Gettysburg. So Custer gets a whole lot more credit than he deserves, and that one bothers me. Maybe it's because of the Reading connection. The Battle of Gettysburg ended with the repulse of Pickett's charge on the afternoon of July 3. Well, that's certainly what you think if you see the movie, right? with Robert E. Lee saying, "General Pickett, see to your division," and Pickett saying, "Sir, I have no division." It's just not the case. There was a cavalry charge by a full brigade of Union cavalry commanded by this fellow, Elon Farnsworth of Illinois, promoted from captain to brigadier general with Custer on June 28th, leads a charge over some of the worst ground you could ever imagine for cavalry operations. Imagine charging on a mounted charge on a horse down a hill that is a very rocky hillside, that's fairly steep, into the teeth of Confederate infantry. Does that sound like something you guys would want to do? With artillery on the ridge behind it? Think the charge of the Light Brigade, folks, because that's about what it was. Farnsworth is killed. He gets to wear his general's star for exactly 4.5 days. But it all happened after the repulsive pickets charge. So when you hear that the Battle of Gettysburg ended with the repulsive pickets charge, just not true. This is another one that makes me crazy. George Gordon Meade just let Lee's army escape back to Virginia without fighting after the Battle of Gettysburg. Just let him go. I could go for about an hour on this topic alone, but let's, there we go. Let's just summarize it by saying there were actually 22 separate engagements covering the span between July 4 and July 14, 1863, July 14 being the day that the Confederates finally made their way back across the Potomac River. There are 22 separate engagements, 2 of which involved infantry, mostly cavalry fighting, but there were 22 separate engagements, and there were significant casualties that were accumulated as a consequence of these 22 different events that take place during the course of the retreat from Gettysburg. Now, it's also important to note the circumstances were unique. Lee's army had been trapped against the banks of the Potomac River through heavy, heavy rains that caused the river to flood. And a Union task force went and cut the ropes to the pontoon bridge across the Potomac River at Falling Waters and destroyed it. So the Confederates have no way to get across the Potomac River. It's too deep to be forded, and they don't have a bridge anymore. So they're going to end up being stuck on the north bank of the Potomac River for about a week. There's no playbook for this. It's never happened before. There's nothing to consult and say, what do we do here? The only other comparable situation was after the Battle of Antietam, when Lee's army escaped across the Potomac River the day after the battle, or excuse me, 2 days after the battle, after staying in place for a day to see whether there was going to be more fighting without anything but a rear guard action. So Meade's got no playbook to consult. He's got to make this up as he goes. And the other thing is he's under strict orders at all times to keep his army between Lee and Baltimore and Washington. He has to do this. He'll be relieved of command if he doesn't. So this also means that until he figures out what Lee's intentions are after the Battle of Gettysburg, he can't leave Gettysburg. And for the first few days, they don't know what Lee's intentions are. It could be he could just go and hole up on the other side of South Mountain and wait for Meade to come attack him, or he could make his way toward Washington, or he could retreat across the Potomac River. And it's not until July 6th, when there's a big fight outside of Williamsport, Maryland, between Union and Confederate cavalry, that Meade finally learns that Lee's army is moving to the Potomac River crossings. And Meade then sets the Army of the Potomac in motion. It marches late in the day on July 7th. It moves out. And by 4 o'clock in the afternoon on July 8th, a big chunk of the 11th Corps has marched 42 miles over a mountain range in heavy rains on miserable roads and is in place to support a cavalry fight at Boonesboro, Maryland. So when you hear that Meade was slow and that Meade didn't move and Meade did nothing to respond to the Confederate retreat, once again, to quote Colonel Potter, horse hockey. It just isn't true. And if you take anything away from here tonight with you, that's the piece that I hope you take. Here's another good one. If a horse on an equestrian monument has 2 hooves raised, the soldier died. John Fulton Reynolds' equestrian monument on the first day shows the horse with 2 feet raised, and Reynolds, of course, is shot and killed early in the morning of July 1st. And then the myth goes, if only 1 hoof is down, then that corps commander was wounded. It's coincidence, folks. It just isn't true. And here's proof positive. This is the monument to James Longstreet. It was erected in Pitzer's Woods. It's obviously not a recent thing as opposed to immediately post-war, but what do you see? Longstreet's horse has 2 hooves raised. He wasn't even wounded, let alone killed. So again, when you hear this, oh, if the monument's got 2 hooves raised, that soldier was killed, it just isn't true. It's just a coincidence. It's a good one, though, and it won't die. Here we go. All of the Gettysburg ghost stories are true. Right? Anybody gone to Gettysburg and gone on one of those ghost tours? You hear some pretty good stories, don't you? No. There are no documented ghost stories that have been verified that pertain to the Battle of Gettysburg. It's a good way to take your money. It's good entertainment, but it just isn't true. So with that, I'll take your questions, and I thank you.
Just a reminder, raise your hand, and interns will have microphones. Save your questions so you get the microphone, so it'll be on the video.
Yeah.
Who's got a question?
I have a question. So on the first day of the battle, you mentioned that Buford, he had different guns. My question is, how were they able to hold the ground given that the Confederates are coming through with the army, but Buford had his cavalry? Because usually, I guess, if you have cavalry and you have the army coming through, that they would take.
One of my very favorite topics. Thank you for asking that question. And by way of background, I first started researching John Buford at Gettysburg in 1992. And my book was published in 2014, so that ought to tell you something. The answer to your question is that Buford dismounted his cavalrymen. Now, keep in mind, a cavalryman's a man and a horse, right? If you're going to get off that horse to fight, somebody's got to hold the horse. They're going to take the horse behind the main line into an area that's protected, but that's close enough that if they need to jump on the horse and get out of there, they can. So this means that 1 out of every 4 men is detailed to hold his horse and 3 of his buddies. That in turn means your effective fighting strength is automatically reduced by 25% because of that. So instead of having 2,900 men to go into battle, Buford's got a reduction of 25% because of the horse holders. He's going to make very good use of the terrain to fight a delaying action. His mission is to trade space for time, the time being needed for the main body of the army, the infantry, to come up. So he's going to fight this very effective delaying action that's going to last a big chunk of the morning on July 1st and hold on until the Union infantry comes up to relieve him and take his place on the fighting line. The purpose is not to defeat the Confederates. He had 10,000 men to face and 2,900 less 25% with which to fight them. He knew he wasn't going to defeat them. That was never the object. The object was to buy time. And it was an extremely effective tactic. It's still taught to this day to soldiers. Who here is a veteran? Who served? Show me a hand. Okay, and I'm sure that those of you who served, I know Al Mackey was, and Chuck, I assume you were a Cold War era soldier. It was always assumed that if the Soviets were going to attack, the attack would come at a place in central Germany called Fulda Gap. And it was always NATO's strategy to fight exactly the same tactics to hold back the Soviet armor long enough for the infantry to come up. They teach the same tactics. They fight the same tactics. That's why Buford's stand at Gettysburg is still taught to soldiers to this day. The more things change, the more they remain the same. Does that answer your question? Anybody else? Looks like Matt's got a question.
So, Eric, do you think it's a myth that Gettysburg was the turning point of the war?
You know, that's a question we all tackle.
Well, I noticed you didn't tackle it tonight.
I didn't tackle it tonight because I was trying to focus on things that were very Gettysburg specific, but that's a great question. And you've got to keep in mind that at the same time that Gettysburg is happening, there are two other major campaigns that are going on. Gettysburg, July 1, 2, and 3, Union victory. Vicksburg surrenders on July 4, meaning that as Lincoln put it, the father of waters again goes unvexed to the sea. And at the same time as all this is going on, William Stark Rosecrans and his Army of the Cumberland are engaging in a campaign in central Tennessee that maneuvers the Confederate Army right out of Tennessee and into Chattanooga and on the border with Georgia with 1,500 casualties. So I'm going to suggest to you that the combination of the three campaigns that are going on simultaneously that concluded at approximately the same time, that was what sounded the death knell for the Confederacy. I don't think you can say that it was just Gettysburg. I think that doesn't do justice to the efforts of Grant's army on the Mississippi and Rosecrans's army in Tennessee. But I think when you combine all three, that was it. That was the moment. Who else has a question? Got one up there. Okay, go ahead, Chuck.
Eric, so we hear a lot about the importance of command teams, and one of the assumptions is that because Stonewall Jackson was not present for Lee, that had an adverse effect on at least the first and second day of operations. What are your thoughts on that, the absence of Stonewall Jackson and the campaign?
Well, if Jackson had been at Gettysburg, he would have been in an advanced state of decomposition. No, I'm kidding. That's a question that I hear a lot, and it all depends on which Jackson would have shown up. Was it the Jackson of Chancellorsville, or was it the Jackson of the Battle of Mechanicsville during the 7 Days campaign when he was really, really bad? So which Jackson would it have been? It's impossible to predict, and it's impossible to predict what would have happened, but I'll suggest to you that had the Confederates taken Culp's Hill on July 1, Meade would have retreated into Maryland, and it would have been a one-day battle. And he would have taken position on a position laid out by his engineers that extended from Manchester, Maryland on one end to Taneytown on the other, that's called the Pipe Creek Line, that would have been an impregnable position for the Confederates to take. It just wouldn't have been possible. So, you know, your guess is as good as mine which Jackson would have showed up.
Right. But the presumption was that Lee did not change his leadership style with the absence of Jackson.
And there's a good reason for that. Let's keep in mind that Ewell has been brilliant on the way to Gettysburg and taking Winchester and defeating Robert Milroy and for all intents and purposes, destroying an entire 8,000-man division. Ewell has been brilliant. He's been spectacular, a worthy successor to Jackson. So Lee probably rightfully assumed that that would continue. And what does he do? He gives Ewell discretionary orders, and Ewell decides not to attack. He had the discretion. If Lee wanted him to attack, he should have ordered it. The orders are, take that hill if practicable. That's discretionary. That's not take the hill. There's a difference.
Hi, I'm over here.
There you are, okay.
So thank you for this great talk. I was born and raised in Gettysburg, and as a young child, I could go to any of the museums for free. So of course, many of the myths that you debunked, I grew up learning. And one of them was about, well, I don't know if it's a myth, so I'm curious to know. So Jenny Wade was considered to be the only civilian killed at Gettysburg, that she was making bread, and then the tale that's often told on the side is, yes, she was making bread, but it was this kind of bread. So I'm just wondering what you can tell us about Jenny Wade.
So that fun myth is that Jenny Wade was, shall we say, a working girl. And you heard me talk about Wesley Culp earlier. She was engaged to Wesley Culp. And it's one of those fascinating little vignettes of the Battle of Gettysburg, that Wesley Culp is mortally wounded in battle and dies, and that she's the only civilian that dies as a consequence of catching a stray bullet on July 2nd. I've never seen anything in 50 plus years of studying the Battle of Gettysburg to lead me to believe that she was doing anything other than making bread in her sister's kitchen. I've never heard that Jenny was a working girl thing backed up with anything that I would consider to be credible evidence. Great question, though. Thank you.
Considering all the miscommunications with the Confederate Army, would you argue more that it was a Union victory or more of a Confederate loss? Was there ever really that chance of Confederate success, or was it more a Union victory?
Does it matter? But the question is, was it a Union victory or Confederate defeat? I would suggest to you that it's both. In the end, Lee did an absolutely brutal job of managing that battle, and George Gordon Meade fought the battle of his life under some incredibly adverse circumstances, not the least of which was losing 3 of his 7 corps commanders, including the 2 he relied on most heavily, after only having been in command of the Army for 2.5 days, with a chief of staff that he hated and who hated him, that he couldn't work with. The fact that the Union Army won that battle is nothing short of remarkable, and it's because Meade managed a fantastic defensive fight at a time when Robert E. Lee picked to have his worst day of the war, worst days of the war. So the answer to your question is, it's both. As George Pickett once put it, the Yankees had something to do with it. Anybody else?
Legend has it that Gettysburg was sort of a location of happenstance. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the kind of circumstances that led to the fight actually coming to Gettysburg.
That's a great question, too. So, again, those of you who have served are familiar with a term called a meeting engagement. What's a meeting engagement? A meeting engagement is an engagement where 2 forces come together unexpectedly and it develops into a general engagement. And it's often said that the Battle of Gettysburg was a meeting engagement, that the 2 armies blundered together there. And again, the facts just simply don't support that. If you study the events of June 30 carefully, this is what you find. You find that on the morning of June 30th, Buford has a skirmish with Confederate infantry near Fairfield, Pennsylvania. He breaks off because he's under orders to get to Gettysburg. He goes to Emmitsburg. He comes up the Emmitsburg Road. He stops and reports to John Fulton Reynolds what he has just seen. He then goes on to Gettysburg and establishes his defense. He proceeds to send a series of incredibly accurate intelligence reports back to headquarters, telling the exact dispositions of these Confederate troops. And then, about sundown on June 30th, Meade sends a staff officer, a fellow by the name, coincidentally, of Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Dickinson, a descendant of John Dickinson. So again, we've got a connection to the college here. He sends Joseph Dickinson on a ride from Meade's headquarters at Taneytown. He's to go see Buford, find out what Buford's intentions are, which he does. Buford tells him exactly what his plans are the next day. He's to ride from there to Emmitsburg to find Reynolds, to not only tell Reynolds what Buford's intentions are, but to find out what Reynolds' intentions are. And then he rides back to headquarters at Taneytown and tells Meade exactly what's going on here. Meade knows what the dispositions of the Confederates are. Meade knows where they're headed. Meade knows what Buford's intentions are, which are to hold the town. Buford's then going to design this defensive scheme that's going to be a delaying action to buy time for the infantry to come up with positions he has selected in advance. That, by very definition, means it can't be a meeting engagement. It can't be. If one side is prepared and has prepared a defense and is ready to receive an attack, it by definition cannot be a meeting engagement. Was there a failure of intelligence on the Confederate side? You bet. And that's where Stewart being gone had an impact. But it wasn't a meeting engagement. The Union position was carefully chosen and well planned, with full knowledge of the disposition of the Confederate forces. They knew Ewell's Corps was coming from Carlisle. Early's division was coming from York. They knew Hill's Corps was at Cashtown. The only thing they didn't know was the exact location of Longstreet's Corps, but they knew where 2/3 of the Confederate Army was. So when the fighting breaks out on the morning of July 1st, it's not a coincidence, and it's not an unplanned thing. I hope that answers your question. Anybody else?
I thought your slide with the 22 engagements when Lee was retreating, I thought that slide was interesting. About a week ago, I was reading a letter that Lincoln had written to Meade, basically reprimanding him for not pursuing the Confederate Army, but the letter was never sent.
Correct.
Do you think that's what contributed to the myth that the Army did not pursue?
It absolutely was. And let me give you some context for that. One of the Union Corps commanders was a fellow named Oliver Otis Howard, O.O. Howard. Howard's got a bad reputation because his guys broke and ran at Chancellorsville, and they broke and ran at Gettysburg, and I jokingly often call him Uh-oh Howard because of that. This is the same man who founded Howard University in the years after the war, the head of the Freedmen's Bureau. A good man, not a great soldier, but a good man. Howard, of all people, went to Lincoln because he'd heard that Lincoln was furious with Meade for not attacking, went to Lincoln and said, I have seen the Confederate defenses along the river, and I can tell you, the Union Army, the Army of the Potomac, could not have taken that position. And that had Meade attacked it, it would have been a bloodbath. Meade made the right decision, he told Lincoln. And Lincoln, about a week later after mulling it over, changed his mind and ultimately sent Meade a letter congratulating him on his conduct of the campaign. It's a classic example of, I'm an armchair quarterback. I'm not on the battlefield. I don't know the conditions. I don't know what the positions look like. I don't know anything other than what I see on a map, and it sure looks to me like he should have attacked Lee and destroyed him. But it's not that simple. It's not even anything remotely close to that simple. And Lincoln realized that he was wrong. And he was a big enough person to acknowledge that he was wrong. So it's a good thing he didn't send that letter, because I guarantee you Meade would have resigned his commission, and that would have been the end of that. And that would have been a very bad thing for the Union Army. Anybody else? Hi, Al.
Eric, thanks for a typically outstanding performance. We can't blame Stewart because Beverly Robertson didn't follow his orders, but we certainly can blame Stewart because he knew that Beverly Robertson was an incompetent. Can we blame him for not leaving someone else in charge instead of Beverly Robertson?
So the question I have to ask you in return is, and Al, is who?
Wade Hampton.
Well, Stewart wanted Hampton with him because he wanted Hampton's talent. So instead, you've got this force that's commanded by Robertson and Jones is junior to Robertson. So Robertson ends up in command by seniority. Longstreet thought that they would leave Hampton, and in retrospect, maybe he should have. But you got to understand that Jeb Stuart couldn't stand either Robertson or Jones. He hated them both. He didn't want them with him.
Right.
So who's he going to do? If he leaves Hampton, he's got to take one of these two guys that he can't stand.
Well, alternately, you relieve Robertson and put his second in command in charge, and then Jones is in charge.
Well, that's a possibility. But, you know, that's hindsight being 20/20. Your point's well taken, though. Thanks, Al. Anybody else?
One more question. We'll let Colonel Allen have
So thanks, Eric, for going through the Battle of Gettysburg. We know that the 19th of November is the anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. And we have a lot of attribution as to what that was intended to do and its impact in our nation. As the last question, what's your interpretation of that impact, and what can we look forward to in the future in terms of figuring out how we figure out strategy national will and national commitment?
Wow, what a great question. You could write books about that one. Lincoln had the ability to cut to the chase. And maybe it's because he was a lawyer and understood the power of the spoken and written word. He had the ability to cut to the chase. And after his speech, after hearing Edward Everett ramble for nearly 3 hours, Everett went to Lincoln and said, "You said more in 2.5 minutes than I said in 3 hours." Lincoln got it. To bind up the nation's wounds, as he put it in his second inaugural speech, to care for the widows and orphans, to bind the country's wounds. That process began at Gettysburg on November 19th with the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery, and it continued with the second inaugural address, and it died with Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater, which is a tragedy for the country. It's hard to say what Reconstruction would have looked like under Lincoln, but we do know that when the meeting was held between Lincoln and Admiral Porter and Sherman and Grant at City Point in the spring of 1865, Lincoln said, "Let them up easy." And I guarantee you that Reconstruction under an Abraham Lincoln administration would have looked very different from the way it looked under a vengeful, angry, radical Republican administration and a really impotent president in Andrew Johnson that made those wounds take a lot longer than they needed to heal, and probably never really did. I've often believed and said that I think the greatest tragedy of the Civil War was the fact that Lincoln didn't live to finish the work. Because I think had Lincoln lived to finish the work, the complexion of this country might be a little different today. And that's the great if, and that's what I'll leave you to take away with you tonight, is what would this country have looked like had Lincoln not been assassinated? We'll obviously never know, but it's a tantalizing question. And with that, I thank you.